Many people assume that the era of chains and direct coercion has faded into the past, remaining only on the pages of ancient history textbooks. We are accustomed to considering modern society the pinnacle of humanism and freedom. However, if we cast aside illusions and look at the foundation upon which all modern jurisprudence stands, a completely different picture emerges. The legal systems of Russia, all European nations, and most countries of the world are built on the monumental foundation of Roman law. It is crucial to realize that Roman law is, first and foremost, a set of laws designed for a slave-owning society. It is a system created to regulate relationships in a world where owning another human being was the norm. And this structure has not disappeared. It has merely adapted, changed its terminology, and taken deep root in the modern world order. To understand the scale of this legal trap, we must look at the economic essence of slavery. It is simple and cynical. A free man owns the results of his labor, whereas a slave does not. This is the fundamental divide between freedom and servitude. If you carefully read the texts of modern constitutions and labor codes, you will discover an astonishing substitution of concepts. The basic law solemnly proclaims that labor is free, forced labor is prohibited, and everyone is free to choose their profession. However, what exactly does the law guarantee? It guarantees the right to remuneration for labor, the right to safe and hygienic conditions, and protection against unemployment. But nowhere does it state that the product created belongs to the creator. In this coordinate system, only the right to receive a ration, compensation for expended effort, is recognized. The results of the labor itself are alienated. They do not belong to the citizen. In fact, the modern economic model reproduces the ancient Roman scheme, where everything produced is taken from the workers, and a certain reward is handed down from the master's table. The form of this reward is irrelevant, whether it is a bowl of stew in the barracks of an ancient landowner, or a certain amount of printed colored paper in a bank account today. The essence of the contract between the slave and the employer remains unchanged. It is an exchange of lifetime and effort for the means of subsistence, without the right to claim the result of one's work itself. This social structure, based on principles refined over millennia, is reflected not only in economic realities, but also in the very symbolism of state documents, which we are accustomed to ignoring. We live inside a system where the legal status of the individual is blurred, and the true state of affairs is hidden behind complex legal formulations. If you believe this is merely wordplay or legal casuistry that does not affect your real life, you are deeply mistaken. Things become much more serious when we begin to analyze exactly how the law divides living people into categories, and why in the legal field the concepts of human and citizen are not synonyms at all, but two completely different statuses with opposing sets of rights. The distinction between the seemingly synonymous concepts of human and citizen in the legal field is the key to understanding the hidden caste system in which we exist. If you carefully study the text of the fundamental law, you can notice a duality of terminology that seems strange at first glance. Some articles speak of human rights, others of civil rights, and sometimes these concepts stand side by side, but connected by the conjunction "and." This grammatically and logically confirms that these are two different legal subjects. This linguistic nuance goes back centuries, directly to the structure of Roman society, which was rigidly hierarchical. In ancient Rome, there was an elite stratum, the patricians, or quirites. These were representatives of the original clans who possessed full rights solely by virtue of their birth. They did not need to ask for permission. Their status was natural and inalienable. Opposing them were the plebeians, the mass of the population, restricted in rights, whose lives were regulated by a separate set of laws known as the Law of Nations, Jus Gentium. Plebeians did not possess rights by nature. Their opportunities were granted or limited by the state. Transferring this matrix to modern times, we see a perfect match. The legal status of a human in constitutions corresponds to the status of a patrician. Fundamental human rights and freedoms are declared inalienable and belonging to everyone from birth. This is the highest form of existence in the legal field. However, the status of a citizen is a direct analogy to the plebeian. Citizenship is a link between a person and the state, certified by a special document with legal force. By becoming a citizen, a living subject accepts duties and restrictions written in the laws, essentially voluntarily stepping down a rung in the hierarchy. The fact that a slave considers himself a free man is null and void from a legal point of view if he holds a slave's papers. In the judicial system and administrative practice, priority is always given to the paper status. You can consider yourself anyone you like, but if you present a passport, you enter the game according to the rules for citizens, that is, for the subordinate class. The most striking confirmation that the population is viewed by the system specifically as a disenfranchised mass is the term referendum. The second, historical, and quite official name for this procedure is plebiscite. The etymology of this word leaves no room for double interpretation. It is the opinion of the plebs, a decision made by the plebeians. By participating in a plebiscite, the voter automatically, by the very fact of participation, signs off on belonging to the category of the plebs, a class deprived of full patrician rights. The system speaks to us openly in the language of Roman law, but we have forgotten how to understand this language, mistaking legal terms for common words. We live in a setting where legal fictions have replaced reality. The human, possessing natural rights, is hidden behind the mask of the citizen, who is obliged to obey regulations. This substitution did not happen yesterday. It stretches through millennia, masquerading as social progress. But if you scrape off the layer of modern paint from state institutions, ancient brickwork is revealed underneath. You might ask, where did ancient Rome go if its principles are so alive? The answer will surprise you. It never disappeared. It simply changed its sign and the surname of its rulers. Conventional history teaches us that the Roman Empire fell under the blows of barbarians many centuries ago, leaving behind only the ruins of the Colosseum and Latin in medical prescriptions. However, this is a fundamental misconception concealing the true nature of power. Rome is not a point on the map of Italy, not a specific time period, and not even a nationality. Rome is, above all, a status of social organization, a universal operating system of governance based on rigid hierarchy and the principles of slavery. If we view history through this lens, it becomes obvious that the empire never died. It merely changed its borders, names, and capitals, flowing from one form to another, but retaining its predatory essence. This historical relay race can be traced with frightening clarity. After the formal fall of Rome, its direct heir became the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us as Byzantium or Romania. Then the baton was intercepted by the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, founded by Otto the Great as a direct continuation of the antique tradition. This state entity dominated Europe right up until the era of Napoleon. Even in modern history, terminology betrays this continuity. The infamous Third Reich literally translates as the Third Empire. Logic suggests that the First Reich was considered the Holy Roman Empire, and the second was the German Empire of the Kaisers. The titles of the rulers themselves leave no doubt about their origin. You don't need to be a linguist to hear the Latin Caesar in the German title Kaiser. Similarly, the Russian title Tsar is a phonetic adaptation of the same word Caesar. The rulers of Europe and Russia bore the name of the Roman emperor for centuries, asserting their right to own people as property. The Russian Empire was also deeply integrated into this system. It is no coincidence that the concept "Moscow is the Third Rome" became the state ideology. Claims to Roman status were unambiguously encoded even in the surname of the ruling dynasty. The Romanovs are literally the Romans, from the Latin root Roma. This is not just a family name, it is a declaration of belonging to the global elite governing the world according to Roman templates. Similar markers can be found everywhere, from the name of the country Romania, from Romanus, to the multitude of state institutions copying the structure of the Senate and prefectures. Thus, Rome, as a principle of social organization, survived all revolutions and wars, remaining the only real form of statehood. Politicians may change slogans, constitutions may be rewritten, and forms of government may transform from monarchies to republics, but the deep structure remains the same. It is a corporation managing resources and human capital. Words are often used to deceive and distract. Rhetoric can be as democratic as you please. However, words can lie, but symbols never do. They speak directly to the subconscious and mark the territory of power. If you look closely around you, you will discover that ancient signs of punitive power and fascist ideology are not in history books, but right before your eyes. On the facades of government buildings, in the design of monuments, and on the emblems of law enforcement agencies. The legal system we are discussing cannot exist only on paper. It requires instruments of coercion and visual reinforcement of its power in the consciousness of the masses. The symbolism surrounding us in everyday life is often perceived as meaningless decoration or a tribute to tradition, but in reality it is open code, communicating who is in charge and by what rules the game is played. The central element of this visual language is the fasces. It is not just a bundle of sticks, as it might seem at first glance. Fasces, or lictor bundles, are a bundle of rods, usually birch or elm, tied with a red cord or straps, with an axe or hatchet, called a labrys, inserted in the middle. In ancient Rome, this object was the main attribute of the power of kings, and later of the highest magistrates. They were carried by lictors, special officials who performed the functions of bodyguards and, far more importantly, executioners. The symbolism here is brutally concrete. The rods were intended for corporal punishment, and the axe for beheading or capital punishment. Thus, the fasces is an ancient symbol of the state's right to use physical violence against its subjects. It is from the Latin word fascis, bundle, that the name of the political movement, fascism, and the National Fascist Party of Italy originated. However, despite the ominous history of the 20th century, this symbol did not disappear after the victory over Nazism. On the contrary, fasces are widely represented in the state symbolism of modern democracies and agencies. If you pay attention to the emblem of the Federal Penitentiary Service, you can see that it is literally permeated with this Roman paraphernalia, confirming the continuity of punitive functions. Fasces adorn the fences of parks in St. Petersburg, are found in the design of government buildings in France, and even in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is a global marker indicating that the territory is governed by the laws of Rome, where the right of force is fundamental. No less interesting is another ubiquitous symbol, the scales, or Libra. We are accustomed to associating them with the goddess of justice, Themis, believing they symbolize the weighing of arguments for and against in search of the truth. However, in the context of Roman private law, the meaning of the scales is completely different and strictly mercantile. Scales were an obligatory instrument of the mancipatio procedure, a solemn rite of transferring ownership of important things, which included land, livestock, and, of course, slaves. A piece of metal, copper or bronze, was placed on the scales, serving as payment and defining the value of the live cargo. Libra is a unit of weight, from which the Roman pound and the name of the currency lira originated. Thus, the scales in court are not a symbol of justice, but an instrument for assessing damages or the value of property. which, in this coordinate system, is the defendant himself. Completing this picture is the appearance of the arbiters of the law. The robes worn by judges and the togas of prosecutors are a direct reference to Roman clothing. In Rome, only quirites, free citizens and slave owners, had the right to wear a toga. For slaves and foreigners, wearing a toga was forbidden. The snow-white toga, the toga candida, was particularly distinct. It was worn by candidates for high office, hence the modern word candidate. By donning a robe, a judge visually separates himself from everyone else present, declaring his status as a patrician with the right to judge, while everyone else in the courtroom is by default demoted to the status of subordinates. The symbols speak for themselves, but let's look at the very concept of the state. You will be surprised, but between your country and a mafia clan, from the point of view of Roman law, there is no difference. We are used to asking naive questions about what a state is, expecting to hear lofty answers about the social contract, protection of the population, and cultural community. However, if we cast aside school illusions and turn to etymology and law, a cynical truth is revealed. The most common form of government today is the republic. This word comes from the Latin expression res publica. Res translates as an affair, thing, or property, and publica as public. The traditional translation is the public affair. It sounds noble until we draw a linguistic parallel with another, no less famous Italian expression that means exactly the same thing. Translated into Italian, which is a direct heir to vernacular Latin, public affair, or our affair, sounds like Cosa Nostra. Why did a famous mafia structure choose a name that so clearly echoes a form of government? Or rather, why does the state structure bear a name so close in meaning to the name of a criminal syndicate? The answer lies in the fact that, from the perspective of Roman law, there is no fundamental difference between them. The state, the corporation, and the armed group are simply forms of associating people to manage common resources. Roman jurists define such unions very clearly. They are associations permitted to form a union under the name of a college or partnership. They acquire the property of having common things, a common treasury, and a representative, or syndic, through whom they act as a single legal entity. This legal formula is universal. It describes the operating principle of any corporation. History knows many examples where the line between the state and a private company was completely blurred. Remember the British East India Company or the Russian American Company? These were commercial structures that had their own flags, minted their own coins, maintained regular armies, built fortresses, and waged full-scale wars of conquest. For example, the Opium Wars in China or the conquest of India were waged not by states in the modern sense, but by corporations protecting their assets. These structures possessed de facto sovereignty. Today's states are the same corporations, just scaled up, and legitimized through a system of international recognition. The essence of such a structure is the efficient management of property for the benefit of the beneficiaries. That is, those at the head of the college. Roman law clearly states that the union owns common things. But what is the main thing in a slave-owning society? It is the people themselves, the population. Citizens in this coordinate system are not participants in governance, but assets listed on the corporation's balance sheet. The public affair is the business of managing you as a resource. All patriotic slogans serve only as a screen for the corporate interests of the ruling elite, those modern patricians who view the country's territory as their patrimony. Understanding the state as a business structure or syndicate completely changes the perception of reality. You stop seeing taxes as a contribution to the common good and begin to see them as a subscription fee for the right to be in the territory controlled by a given corporation. Laws turn into internal company regulations mandatory for personnel. And here arises the most uncomfortable question. If the state is a corporation owning resources, then who are you in this scheme? You might think you are an employee or a shareholder, but that is a mistake. Employees are paid salaries from profits. Shareholders receive dividends. You, on the contrary, pay for everything yourself. In the harsh logic of Roman law, you are inventory, living property. And the scariest part is that you signed the contract for this position yourself, without even realizing the moment it happened. The mechanism by which free will turns into a legal obligation has been honed over centuries and lies in the principle of voluntary consent. In Roman law, as in its modern interpretations, there is an immutable rule. Slavery cannot be imposed by force. It must be accepted. For the system to work stably, the subject must confirm their subordinate status with their own hand or voice. Historically, this process was formalized through religious and administrative rituals, the meaning of which remained vague to the uninitiated, but the legal consequences were fatal and indefinite. If we turn to the documents of the era of the formation of the Russian Empire, we will see a striking frankness of wording, which is today hidden behind bureaucratic newspeak. Peter the Great's decree of 1700 actually equated baptism into the Orthodox faith with entering eternal serfdom in the name of the sovereign. It was an act of transferring soul and body into the property of the supreme ruler. Later, the Senate decree of Empress Elizabeth of 1747 consolidated this practice for foreigners wishing to accept Russian subjecthood. The text of the oath required one to pronounce terrible words. I promise and swear to be a faithful, kind, and obedient slave, and an eternal subject with my surname. The key word here is eternal. The person taking the oath signed a contract not only for themselves, but for their entire lineage, transferring their surname and descendants into the state inventory list. The fierce resistance with which people once opposed the census and forced baptism becomes understandable. They intuitively felt that this was an act of legal enslavement. Today, the principle subject equals serf has not disappeared. It has only changed its terminology to something more euphonious. The concept of citizenship performs the same function of binding a living person to a state corporation. The clearest proof of the slavish essence of citizenship is the impossibility of simply renouncing it. Try declaring that you no longer want to be listed in the registry of any country. The system will resist this with all its might. Legally, you cannot become no one's. You are obliged to belong to a sovereign. The procedure for renouncing citizenship of one country almost always requires guarantees of acceptance into the citizenship of another. This resembles the rules for handling inventory or livestock. Property can be transferred or sold, but it cannot simply walk into the forest and become sovereign. Here we approach the true meaning of the word emancipation, which many mistakenly consider a synonym for liberation. The suffragette movement, or the struggle for minority rights, often takes place under this slogan. But in Roman law, mancipatio is a procedure for fixing property rights, from manus, hand, and capio, to take. Accordingly, emancipation is leaving from under one hand, but not leaving for freedom. A slave undergoing the emancipation procedure, or a woman leaving her father's guardianship, simply changed owners. In a modern context, this means moving from private dependence to state dependence. By leaving the authority of the family or community, the individual falls into direct dependence on the state corporation, becoming its direct asset. The passport in your pocket is not a pass to a world of opportunities, but a certificate of belonging, an inventory tag with a number confirming that the bearer is an object of the law, not its source. You voluntarily accept these rules, receiving documents and signing registries, assuming this is the natural order of things. We are proud of our status, considering ourselves the pinnacle of evolution. But the scariest thing is hidden, not in laws that can be rewritten, nor in passports that can be burned. The trap lies in the very language we use to describe ourselves. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, saying it with pride. But if we translate this from Latin honestly, discarding school euphemisms, you will feel uneasy. For the true meaning of this term destroys the last illusions of our greatness. The most shocking discovery, capable of overturning all ideas about humanity's place in this world, is the linguistic analysis of the very term we are so proud of. Biologists and anthropologists have taught us to call ourselves Homo sapiens, imbuing this concept with the meaning wise man, the crown of creation, and the pinnacle of evolution. However, Latin is a precise, cynical language that tolerates no double interpretations if one knows its true roots. Let's break down each word of this definition, discarding school euphemisms, and look the frightening truth in the face. The word homo etymologically traces back to the concepts of humus, soil, earth, dirt. In the deepest sense, homo is an earthling, not in the sense of an inhabitant of the planet, but in the sense of created from dust, a biological substance, organic matter. In Roman law, the term homo was often used as a synonym for a slave, that is, a creature devoid of legal personality, a thing. A free man possessing rights was called vir, man, hero, by the Romans, but never homo. Thus, the first part of our self-designation already lowers us to the level of animated soil, a nutrient medium. But the real abyss opens when analyzing the second word, sapiens. We were taught that this means intelligent or wise. However, the root of this word lies in the verb sapio. If you open complete Latin dictionaries and look at the primary, direct meanings of this verb, we see to have taste, to be tasty, to smell of something. The meaning to be sensible or to understand is secondary, figurative, arising later as a metaphor for having good taste in judgment. The suffix ens in Latin forms a participle. Consequently, sapiens literally means having flavor, juicy, or nutritious. Combining the two words, we get not wise man, but tasty earthling, or nutritious humus. A biological resource possessing certain gustatory qualities for those who coined this name. This interpretation forces a completely different look at famous historical scenes. Remember the trial of Pontius Pilate over Christ? The Roman procurator brings the beaten prisoner out to the crowd and pronounces the famous phrase, ecce homo. The Church translates this as, behold the man, giving the words a shade of compassion or greatness. But Pilate was a Roman official, judging by the laws of the empire. For him, it was important to determine the legal status of the defendant. A citizen of Rome could not be flogged and crucified without a special decision of the Senate. By announcing ecce homo, Pilate was actually reading the verdict, behold the slave. He stated that before him was a disenfranchised creature, a thing, a homo, falling under the jurisdiction of slave law who could be executed. The crowd raged not because they saw a man, but because this status canceled any claims to royal greatness. If we accept this logic, the entire structure of Roman law and its modern heirs looks like a farm management manual. The patricians, the fathers, possibly viewing themselves as beings of a different order, created a system where the population is a renewable resource. We are the humus upon which their well-being is built. And perhaps it is not just about labor and taxes, but about something more sinister, related to the life energy we give to the system. Now the phrase, "we are not slaves," sounds completely different. We are not just slaves, we are food. And the system is built so that we never understand this, taking pride in the pretty labels on our cages. Putting all the fragments of this colossal mosaic together, we arrive at a frightening but inevitable conclusion. Roman law is not a dusty artifact of history, but a perfectly tuned operating system of global exploitation that has not failed for 2,000 years. It has survived the fall of empires, changes in religion, technological revolutions, and world wars. The secret of its survival lies in ingenious mimicry. If in ancient times chains were iron and visible, today they have become legal, paper, and digital. The system has evolved from crude coercion to sophisticated consent management, where the slave himself strives to obtain the brand of a citizen, seeing it as protection and privilege, not realizing it is a stamp of ownership. Realizing the depth of the trap comes through understanding the linguistic snares set at every step. Even the very concept of freedom we strive for has been substituted. In English, which has become the modern lingua franca, there are two terms: freedom and liberty. We are told they are synonyms, but legally they are antonyms. Freedom is the state of being free from birth, natural will requiring no permission. This is the status of a patrician or a wild creature. Liberty, however, comes from the Latin libertas, the status of a freed slave or a sailor granted shore leave. Liberty is freedom granted by a master, temporary, limited by the boundaries of what is permitted, and, most importantly, revocable. The Statue of Liberty is a monument not to freedom, but precisely to liberty. That is, the regulated rights of a slave within the system. We fight for civil rights and liberties, meaning extending the length of the leash, without even thinking about removing the collar. Exiting this matrix is incredibly difficult, because it covers the entire surface of the planet. There is no more no man's land. Every square meter is the territory of one corporation state or another. You cannot simply get up and leave, because outside the legal field of one corporation, you immediately fall into the jurisdiction of another. A passport is your pass between the barracks of a global camp, not an identification of personality. Your personality, your living essence, does not interest the system at all. It is interested in your persona, a legal mask, from the Latin persona, actor's mask, that you put on when entering social relations. It is the mask that is judged, fined, and taxed, but you pay for it, with your life, time, and energy. Now that this layer of information has been lifted, everyone inevitably faces the question, who am I now? Knowledge is an irreversible process. You will no longer be able to look at your passport, a courthouse, or a tax return with the same eyes. Instead of familiar state symbols, you will see the fasces of lictors and owners' brands. In the word human, you will hear the echo of nutritious soil. This knowledge is a heavy burden, but it is also the only key to real awakening. Realizing one's status is the first step toward changing reality, even if only internally for now. But be careful, the system does not like those who see its true structure. By declaring, "I am a man," or trying to break contracts, remember that you are entering into a confrontation with a mechanism that has honed methods of suppression for millennia. The main question that remains open and now sounds like an alarm bell is, are you ready to stop being a resource and take on the responsibility that true, not declared, freedom implies? Or is a cozy cage with a guaranteed ration and the illusion of rights still dearer than the cold wind of true reality? Only you know the answer to this question now.